Welcome to the Mason Duchatschek Show. This episode is brought to you by Workforce Alchemy, helping leaders improve hiring, engagement, and retention while uncovering people-related profit leaks hidden in everyday operations. Today's guest is Andrea Carter, a globally respected organizational scientist and workplace belonging expert whose work sits at the intersection of neuroscience, human behavior, and business performance. She is the founder and CEO of Belonging First, a groundbreaking, evidence-based methodology and consultancy that helps executive leaders and organizations measure and design workplaces where people feel seen, safe, and able to contribute their best. Because when belonging thrives, performance follows. She's an adjunct professor in industrial and organizational psychology, a member of the Forbes Business Council, and a TEDx and keynote speaker who bridges rigorous research with real-world leadership practice. Super excited to have you on today. Thanks so much for joining the show.
Thank you, Mason. I'm super excited to be here with you. I love your podcast, so it's a delight to be here and be an actual guest.
Well, we're going to have some fun today, and we're going to hopefully share some ideas that are impactful and influential to people who are listening and watching. So I'm going to hit you with an easy one right out of the gates. How do you define belonging in the context of organizational performance, and why should every CEO even care about it?
Well, let me frame this from a conversation that I had with a CFO only 18 months ago that completely changed how I talk about this work. And I was presenting belonging data, okay? And it was the executive team of a mid-sized manufacturing company, about 3,000 employees. And, we just completed their belonging assessment. I was walking them through the 5 indicators of belonging, which are comfort, connection, contribution, psychological safety, and well-being. I'll get into that in a minute. And I could see that, the CEO and the CHRO are nodding and they're taking notes and they're right in there. But the CFO is leaning back and he's got his arms crossed. And he finally said, Andrea, this sounds very nice. So politely, Andrea, this sounds very nice. But how does this even connect to whether, we hit our production targets? And I said, well, let me show you something. And I pulled up the data we'd been tracking. And we weren't only just tracking belonging indicators, okay? We actually track a number of specific elements that all mediate how performance works in the organization. And so this specific organization had 2 manufacturing plants. And in that organization, essentially those plants, they had similar sizes. I think one was about 100 people more than the other one, but that's not really significant in a company of 3,000. They had similar product lines. They had similar equipment. So plant A had strong belonging scores across all 5 indicators. Plant B had fractured belonging, low comfort, transactional or low connection, invisible contribution, low to no psychological safety, and well-being showed really that there was disability numbers that were on the rise from burnout. So what it looked like in business terms was really that Plant A had higher on-time delivery rates. They caught quality issues, for example, earlier, specifically because people felt safe flagging those problems. When equipment went down, cross-functional teams were actually collaborating to solve it faster, right? Because they had trust, they had clear communication patterns. And their turnover was 12% compared to Plant B's 28%. So when we asked employees a really great question after the survey came out, we asked them, would you go above and beyond during a crunch? And 82% of them said yes, and without hesitation. Plant B, they hit their numbers, but they weren't always consistent. They were doing what I call more of an extraction performance, which is not a sustainable performance. And what that means is, managers are really pushing harder to get people to compensate for the chaos that they're in. And let's face it, the world is in a lot of chaos right now. So we have a lot of managers doing this,
Sure.
But people were showing up and executing tasks but they weren't actually thinking critically. And what was happening was that if they maybe saw a problem on the line, they didn't say anything because speaking up felt risky. They'd watched others do it in the past. And what was happening was that maybe somebody was criticized for doing it. Maybe somebody was laughed at. Maybe they were penalized in hours, or afterwards they were somehow left out of, meetings or conversations that were important to them. So really what we then ended up seeing was that there was this equipment downtime that always lasted longer than plant A. And it was because their people weren't collaborating. They were protecting their territory
Sure.
rather than rallying together, right? And so when they were asked to go that extra mile, guess how many said they would?
Which one?
Of
Which
plant
group?
B, of plant B.
That's the engaged one? You got me.
That's the disengaged one.
The disengagement,
Yeah.
probably, honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if none of them.
Well, 34%, but that's a
Okay.
huge gap
Practically
there,
none
right?
of them.
You still have people that were, showing up. But
That's
here's
good
the
to know.
thing. Here's the thing. The CFO looked at me, and what he said to me, and this is what changed everything for me. He said, okay, so belonging is actually about whether my infrastructure then can actually handle volatility. And that was exactly the moment that I went, okay, belonging is infrastructure, and it allows you to move through volatility and friction without breaking, slowing, or losing innovation. And this is what the neuroscience shows us. Okay. So here's the thing. When belonging infrastructure is absent, people's brains have to default to threat responses. So their nervous system is always scanning for danger. Am I safe here? Can I trust these people? Does my work matter? Do I matter? Will I be punished if I speak up? Right? Am I going to burn out? And all of that, it burns energy in the brain. So that's the energy that we actually need to innovate, to problem solve, and to actually perform. And when comfort, the first indicator, isn't present, and you get comfort not from like being nice, comfort is about clarity and predictability. And so when you have that, cortisol levels drop and people stop spending cognitive resources on figuring out like what's happening? What do people expect of me? Do I know how I can actually show up? Am I going to be in trouble for this? And when that happens, the brain, when it has comfort, it actually innovates, it problem solves, it shows up more. So that team A or plant A, they were in that state. They could work together without hesitation. And so that was just one of those indicators. When we look at the other five, the other four, connection, just as a brief overview, that one exists through trust instead of transaction. And what that means is that you're building relationships built on trust, not transaction. That actually makes your oxytocin in your brain. It makes people connect and it makes people bond. And so that connection creates bond, which allows people to extend themselves for each other.
I have
Yeah,
an
go ahead.
immediate example that's jumping out at me.
Totally.
So I have never done this before, but this winter I decided I'm going to try this snowbird thing. So I
Okay.
had a pod packed up, those pods where you pack
Yeah.
everything up,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
put it on
Yeah.
back truck, ship it down. So I'm in Florida right now, and it's beautiful out. It's like 20 degrees, or it's in the teens at home, and I'm going to go run and hang out at the pool this afternoon. It's in the 70s here, so I'm not complaining. But anyway, my point is the pods people, you have a person that comes and they deliver this thing for this big box, and then someone else comes the next day and picks it up. And then you go to your destination, you show up, and someone drops the pod off, you empty it, and then someone else comes the next day and picks it up. What I was so impressed by when I got to Florida was the person who dropped the pod off with all the stuff in it was incredibly thoughtful to make sure they put it in the best place. They looked for trees and angles to say, how can I best serve the person that I don't know who's going to come after me? Like they belonged. It was not like, this is my job, I just got to dump here. It's going to be someone
Yes.
else's problem down the road. I'm gone. That wasn't the mentality. The mentality was, I want to take great care of your stuff and get it in a position that's easy for you to have it unloaded. And two, I want to really make it really easy for this teammate who I don't even know who they are. but it is my company. I want to make it easy for them to do this well. And the respect and teamwork vibe that I got from them was exactly what you're talking about. This person, it wasn't my job is to go dump this thing off and get out of there as fast as I can. It was I'm part of a team. We work together, and the work I do leaves an impression on the client. The work that people after me leaves an impression on the client. And that impression on the client, what they say, whether it be good or bad, is a reflection on the company that I represent. And it was amazing. And I took
Well, I
the time to
love
give them
that.
a great review because of it.
Yeah.
And I have seen the other ones where it's like, dump it off and get out of here. Not with this particular company. Dump it off, get out of here. Not my problem. See you later.
Yeah.
That exists.
Absolutely it does. And so what you've just talked about is actually the indicator of contribution. And when contribution is visible, there's meaningful impact. So what you just described was meaningful impact. And what that says is that from the neuroscience perspective, dopamine is firing, people are motivated. When people don't matter, and when you haven't done the work to actually create a belonging infrastructure, and what happens really quickly is that they don't care. And they don't care because they are not important. And so when we look at these elements and when we look at these indicators, they all lend to each other. You can't actually create belonging without having all five. And
So let's
that's
talk
the
about those
thing.
5.
Yeah.
You had 5, you hit me with like 5 measurable indicators of belonging that you use to assess a culture.
Yep.
And my question would be, how can leaders begin tracking them and utilizing that data?
Yeah. So let's talk about the measuring of belonging. The first thing that I will say is that I'm going to back up. So I'm going to tell you about the moment that belonging really became crystal clear for me. So I was working as an organizational scientist and culture strategy executive for a global beverage and spirits company. I had just completely redesigned their entire employee listing system. And we weren't just measuring engagement anymore. And remind me to come back to the difference between engagement and belonging, because that's also
Okay,
really, really important.
sure.
And so what we were doing is we were measuring all 5 belonging indicators and then tying them to leader behaviors, right? So I engineered what I call a manager impact index. And what it does is it combines survey analytics, sentiment data from like open-ended responses, and then behavioral metrics like one-on-one frequency, span of control, how managers respond to feedback. So for a long time, we would look at quantifying how individual leaders affected belonging, innovation, and team performance. And what started to happen was that we started to actually look at the data differently. So we stopped asking, did you hit your targets? And we started asking, did you create conditions so that your people could perform sustainably and at their best? Okay. So we found something really interesting that actually made executives incredibly uncomfortable. And what it was that managers who were celebrated as high performers, where they were hitting just their numbers quarter after quarter, but whose team belonging data was a disaster. What started happening was that their well-being scores were bottoming out. People were burning out and they were losing people. Like it was not just a leaky bucket at this point, okay? Connection was transactional, contribution was like invisible, right? So people doing their work, they didn't matter. And these managers weren't building teams. They were extracting short-term results while quietly eroding all of that long-term capacity that we actually need. So people on these teams were burning out and leaving, or they'd stay, but they would quietly disengage. And both of those outcomes, those are expensive,
Sure they are. Absolutely,
right?
100%.
So we also, though, had managers whose quarterly numbers, they weren't always the highest, but they had teams that were consistent across belonging indicators. And over time, those teams outperformed everyone else because they innovated more, they retained their top talent, They moved faster because people trusted each other. They spoke up when they saw problems early, like not at
Sure.
the end, right before things are
Oh,
going
yeah.
live, right? So what happened was that we made belonging non-negotiable. And so we built it into scoreboards. We tied it to compensation, incorporated it into success planning conversations. And if you wanted to advance as a leader in the organization, you actually had to prove through our dashboard that you could create sustainable performance conditions, not just extract results for a quarter or two. And that literally changed everything. So leaders started managing belonging the same way that they managed financial metrics, measuring it, tracking it, being accountable for it. And they saw the business impact. So engagement went up, turnover went down, decision-making quality specifically improved because people really felt safe servicing anything that was coming up, even before it got to crisis. So here's the thing. None of that happens if you're not actually measuring it, right? So you have to be, I think there's a lot of people that say culture matters and that people are our greatest asset. You hear that all the time, but they rarely actually look at rewarding more than just quarterly outcomes. And so when you shift what you're measuring, the data actually forces you to decide, are we optimizing for this quarter? Or are we building infrastructure for the next 5 years? And don't get me wrong, like sometimes you actually do need to optimize for a quarter. Hands down, that happens. But that shouldn't be quarter over quarter over quarter. There still needs to be that infrastructure built over that 5 years, right?
This is a lesson I learned after talking to Coach Bryant Wright. He's a friend of mine, and he was talking about when you have belonging, that the team upholds standards without leadership having to even get involved. And his approach is typically to let the team, self-correct isn't the word he used, but that they held high standards. And if someone's not doing what they're supposed to do because they're safe and because they're comfortable and their belonging isn't contingent upon their performance, so they're willing to stretch and they're willing to to be open and trustworthy, like worthy of
Sure.
trust, that he says that's so much better when you have a peer say, I know you're struggling with this. This is something I can help you with. Would you like some help? Let's work together to get this done. Management doesn't have to be involved, because then he's talking about having a system that is based not on compliance because supervision is there, but discipline when it's absent.
Yeah. So let me share what the research says about that. Most organizations have actually set up fitting in cultures. Now, fitting in cultures require an individual to own 100% of the responsibility to conform to one person's idea of what success is. Okay. Belonging cultures actually require a 50-50 responsibility and accountability. It changes the game. It means that everybody is accountable and responsible to your peer, to your manager, to your leader, and them to you. And so the research actually shows that most of our organizations are built on fitting in climates. And we hear that all the time. We hear corporate fit. Are they a corporate fit? And what happens, and this is shown in sports all the time and time over. It's actually where a lot of my roots come from, and working with CFL and Canadian Football League players and sports. The early part of my career, we always saw the underdogs, and how the underdogs, when they adopted this 50-50 principle, what ended up happening was that they showed up in ways that a fitting in culture doesn't. It will allow the other person to drop the ball rather than do everything to get behind and support that other player that may not have it all together, all in the same piece. And so what it does is we have a lot of organizations that are downsizing right now. And I just had a really great conversation with an organization who was like, okay, Andrea, this is what we're going to do. We're going to get rid of all of our B's and all of our C's, and we're just going to keep all of our A's. And I was like, great, you're going to have A's, B's, and C's within 6 months after you've downsized. And they were like, what do you mean? And I was like, here's the thing about all your A's. I guarantee you that all of your A's are not interdependent players. You have a lot of players who are likely out for themselves, and they have no desire to actually create a team that shows up for them as much as they show up for them, the other person. And so this is the piece where the research actually shows that when we're creating environments, we actually need our A's, B's, and C's, because those people in how they show up in different ways have tremendous value, so that they actually create team. And we know you can't go anywhere in the world today without having a team. Like, it just doesn't happen. And so that's where, with your coach friend that you've been talking about, it's so important for people to understand that and to really understand how you create that. And so
Because
that's where those,
he was talking about how his athletes have all he asks from them is 100% effort. I mean, he goes, because effort is the currency that everyone can spend equally. And he
yeah,
says, my state champions can give me 100%, and my brand new freshman can give me 100%. And that's all I can ask. But I am more happy with a freshman who gives me 100% than some quote superstar that gives me 65%, because the standards shouldn't drop because of status.
that's right.
He's like, I want 100% all the time. And not only do my athletes feel the responsibility of providing 100% of their effort, but also upholding the integrity of the team's effort. And he doesn't always have to get involved, because if someone's slacking a little bit in the workout, he's not over there blowing his whistle saying, pick it up, pick it up, pick it up. One of the one of the seniors might drop
That's right.
back and say, hey, come
Hey,
on, Bob, let's go. You can do it. Let's go. Let's push.
yeah,
Let's get through this together. That's that's how it works. And he's led multiple state championships because of it. But that's a special culture. And status doesn't absolve people from responsibility. They don't get special perks and to get to sidestep the rules because they've achieved great things. In his operation, in his operational system of his team, that kind of performance requires additional responsibility to be a better example for the younger athletes coming up. It's not
yes.
like super. Anyway, go ahead.
No, no, no. What I was going to say there is that that's really, you're talking about that 50-50
Yes,
relationship
100%. Yes, I'm
versus the
talking about.
100% zero. And that's also part of the difference between looking at engagement versus belonging. So engagement asks, are you willing to work hard here? But belonging asks, can you perform at your best here? And your coach friend is actually, well, he may not have the words for that. That's actually the differentiation between those two. And when leaders measure engagement alone, they're measuring effort, and effort can be driven by fear just as easily as it can be driven by genuine
But
commitment.
only for a little while, and that's while the pressure's there. Once that pressure is removed, you're going to see that drop unless you have a culture that isn't dependent upon fear to increase that performance.
Right. So if you don't have belonging, here's where it goes off the walls. So again, you have to have comfort, connection, contribution, psychological safety, and well-being. Those are what the conditions are that actually bring people to their best thinking, to innovate, to stay when things get hard, and to work together when things get hard. When we look at belonging infrastructure, when that is present, people actually move through friction productively. They disagree, they learn, they challenge, they stay engaged when things are difficult and when they're volatile. And so that's like essentially what you're talking about from a sports team. From an organization, you have all sorts of different people that are all meant to come together from different generations, from different, genders. When we look at all of the different intersections of identity, belonging is actually the thing that people are craving so that everyone feels like they are understood. When it's absent, it's really easy for employees to default to flight, fight, freeze, or faint, right? And it's because they're not being valued and their work is also not being recognized. So there's no need to stay engaged, mobilize together and do something hard. Right? You can only see that difference if you see that coming from an engagement perspective. So when we look at, what you're talking about, where people will give their all and then recognize, hey, wait a second, this environment isn't really supporting me. I'm not going to go anywhere. And so we now see that. So this is actually, there's a term for it now called the Great Detachment. And this is what happens when belonging infrastructure collapses. but people don't leave. Okay. So it's actually more dangerous than turnover because it's invisible in a lot of cases until it's too late, because most organizations are measuring for engagement, but they're not measuring for belonging. So I started tracking this a few years ago when I was actually looking at a lot of the belonging data and publishing. My first publication came out in 2022, and then since then I've published over 16 validated papers, as well as worked with over 150,000 employees across 8 industries. So, what we started seeing with this metadata was that originally, after COVID, we started seeing what was called revenge quitting. And this is where people would leave their jobs in anger after a belonging breakdown. You actually still see this with athletes on sports teams when they feel like they're not being valued enough.
Oh,
So maybe,
it wasn't
right?
that long ago. I don't know if you remember the Antonio Brown when he was left the um, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, I think it was,
Yeah,
ripped off his helmet, ripped off his shirt, and
I'm
like he
done.
made it like
Totally. So that's
that's
an example.
Exhibit A.
Yeah, exhibit a great example of revenge quitting. And, this can be things like, they were passed over for a promotion that they thought they deserved. Maybe they were treated badly. Maybe a manager broke trust, whatever that trigger is. They leave angry and they often tell people exactly why they're leaving. Okay, that's revenge quitting. Then there's also a pattern where we have seen confident quitting. And these are the people who leave not because they're angry, but because they know their worth and they're like, you know what? I am clear that you're not going to give me what I need in order to succeed. And so I'm not going to let this organization bring me down. And they leave without drama. They just quietly exit and go somewhere better. Both of those are expensive, but they're at least visible. Okay. Leaders see turnover numbers and they know that they have a problem. There's some way to indicate it. But we're now seeing something really different. And this is also in the current, I would say in the past 18 months, this has certainly gone up. People are staying, but belonging has collapsed. So they're showing up, they'll do the minimum, they'll withdraw everything else. So there's no extra projects. Effort is at 50% because half the time they're actually job searching. Trust is like non-existent. Creativity and discretionary thinking, meh, not really there. So they're technically present. They're in your office or maybe they're like online, but they've checked out emotionally and intellectually. And when you ask them what's wrong, they say things like, well, there's only so much I can do here. We're doing our best with what we have. You keep asking us to do more with less. And guess what? There's no more effort left. Right? They're just done. And those phrases, I would say, are really coded for I've detached. I'm out. So I saw this play out in a really painful way with a senior HR leader. And what happened was that he actually stole somebody's work. And he took somebody's work, it was published. He decided he was going to put it through AI and republish it as his own. But employees already knew that the person who was a specialist in the organization, they could tell just by the reading and the content that the original work was not associated with this specific HR leader. And so I reached out to him and I said, we need to escalate this. You need to actually apologize. You need to be transparent. You want to make sure that you actually give proper credit to this team and specifically to this person. And he didn't want to escalate it. He didn't want to acknowledge. He doubled down. He was like, no, this is my work. Even though when you're an adjunct professor, you have tools to actually run things through to see how much is actually written by a human and not. And so just for fun, we put it through and it was 100% written by AI. And so, he refused to actually name what was broken. And what happened next was textbook Great Detachment. So his direct reports saw that he couldn't be trusted. They saw that he would leverage other people's work as his own and then refuse accountability when caught. And the entire department fractured. And so meetings stopped being efficient. Decisions like literally slowed to a crawl.
Oh, dude,
Projects
absolutely.
right? Projects that should have taken weeks were taking months. People started using the phrase, hey, we're doing our best. Translation, I'm not bringing any of my discretionary effort anymore. I'm not speaking up when I see problems. I'm going to protect myself. And this is what happens when all five indicators of belonging collapse simultaneously. So comfort is gone because there's no predictability or clarity on what you can count on. Connection becomes transactional because trust was broken. Contribution feels invisible because people don't believe their work matters. It's just going to be stolen anyways. Psychological safety evaporates because speaking up has proven to be risky. And well-being suffers because people are all spending their energy on self-protection or on self-protection rather than on recovery and rebounding. And so that's the Great Detachment. It's a quiet crisis. It is something that most organizations don't even know that it's happening. And it shows up in engagement scores way too late to even like trigger alarm bells in your retention data. And so you essentially have the cost of innovation, speed, quality, and the ability to execute on strategy. And all of that starts multiplying in cost very quickly.
And the sad thing is, without metrics like what you're talking about and without having systems in place to measure what you're
Mhm.
talking about, you've got senior executives that have to rely on gut feel.
Yeah.
And you and I both know that in an environment like what you're describing,
Yeah.
the data that gets to the senior level executives is, it'll be a polite phrase here, curated
Mhm.
to cover up anything bad or downplay it, if not straight up hide it and exaggerate anything that's good. And these senior level executives are only able to make decisions based on decisions are only as good as the facts on which they're based. And if what they're getting is more fiction than it is fact, and that's all they have to create the gut feel by which they're going to lead and make decisions, I really see the need for the type of data that you're providing, collecting and monitoring the type of data that you're providing, because that's eliminates a lot of the problem of the, "Hey, I'm not going to be the messenger of bad news. I don't want to get shot."
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because in 2020, um, I'd been doing a lot of the work more from that neuroscience lens, but I set out to really ask and answer the question that had been bothering me for so long. And it was, if belonging is so fundamental to human performance, why isn't anyone measuring it rigorously? And there was plenty of engagement. There's ton. I mean, if you want to research this, you can read about engagement for hundreds of thousands of
Sure, of
years,
course you
right?
can.
But if you want to, and even on culture, that's true as well, and on employee satisfaction, like all of that, the constructs for that are there. But belonging as a distinct construct with measurable dimensions, that literally did not exist.
Okay, you got my curiosity up. So just for the heck of it, what kind of questions, just give me a sample, just whet my appetite here with what kind of questions are people asked that would create these indicators? Can you just give me some sample questions? I'm curious.
Yeah. So with comfort, you'd be asking questions. So remember that comfort is all about clarity and predictability. So while we have specific validated questions, if you were looking at just data that you had access to, you would try and see if how comfortable somebody feels within their environment. You would ask if their role is clear. You would ask if success factors are clear to them. And what I find so fascinating is that, most leaders think that they are being super clear in how they're presenting things. And I would say across the board, most are missing the nuances that our younger generations and people who think about things differently actually need in order for comfort to really be present. And so when we look at some of those basic questions just from a comfort lens, that's where you're actually asking questions that then lead you to what you do after you get survey data, right? And if you look at connection, for example, you're asking questions like, how well do I know, lost my train of thought there.
That's all right. I
Something
was
caught
asking you a
my
question,
eye.
but can you give me some examples of it happens to I affectionately refer to those as brain cramps. And I'm glad it happened to you instead of to me. So it's all right. It happens to the best of them. So what I was asking was if you could give me some examples of some questions that would elicit data that you could utilize to rank these
Right.
factors?
Comfort, you would ask whether or not success factors are clear, for example. Connection, you would ask whether or not you know your colleagues more than just what they do inside the office. Contribution, you would ask something like, I matter here. Psychological safety, you would ask, I can admit a mistake without being punished. Well being, you would ask something to the effect of, I'm not expected to rebound on my own. There's infrastructure that supports my rebounding.
And are these scales like from 1 to 5, so you get a general
Yeah,
idea from your okay, so an
that's right.
employer might be able to look back and say, "Hey, our average is a 4.5 on this, we're pretty strong here," or it's a 1.2 there, that's an issue. So it's not just yes, no, it's a little more detailed, correct?
Yeah, it's very detailed. The other thing that I will say that's really important about how we assess the data is that we don't just look at the averages, because your averages are actually hiding what your outliers are really experiencing. And so one of the things that we really found, when we were measuring, when we first started, was that you could have and this happens with anything, but you could have, scores of 70%, if you will. And leaders go, "Oh, great. Like we got 70% on our belonging indicators." Or we got, 72% on our comfort score. But if you're not actually using multiplicative analysis, you actually don't see where your outliers are. And the people who don't feel belonging are never in the average. They are always on either side of the curve. And so when you look at those elements, you actually have to account for them. And so it's not enough to just look at your surveys and get average scores. You actually have to then look at what those intersections of identity are. What I'll say to this is, it was fascinating when we first started looking at it because originally, we were working with 3,500 participants in my first study. Was 11 Toronto Stock Exchange listed mining companies. I was told I'd be lucky if I got 350 participants. We're like, woohoo, we got 3,500 people are obviously really excited about this. But then what was really interesting was that 75% of the people who actually took the survey were men. And that made sense because if you look at mining is a male dominated industry. And so they had incredible scores. And it wasn't until we actually started looking at those intersections of identity where we started actually looking at, okay, so what are some of the identities that actually push people out? And let's imagine that your background is engineering, that increased your belonging. Whereas if you were in HR, that decreased your belonging. Funny enough, anybody who is in compliance also decrease belonging. So, we all have these different identities within an organization. And what we'll see is that there's certain functions, certain teams that if you're not actually accounting for where they are not the biggest number, your data isn't real data. It's fabricated where it's hiding the actual information that you're needing. And so not only do you have to be asking the right questions to actually measure what you're measuring, you also have to be analyzing it in a way that actually accounts for the intersections of identity.
Okay, very cool. So how should CEOs think about their own actions differently when building a belonging-centric culture?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that I'll say to that is the biggest mistake that leaders make with belonging is that I see this all the time now, is that leaders treat belonging as a rebrand of DEI. And they think that DEI is, the language is getting pushed back, so I'll call it belonging instead. And they fundamentally misunderstand what belonging is and why it matters. And so let me give you a real example of this. I was brought on to consult with a logistics organization, and they had just gone through a really painful DEI audit. And they'd invested heavily, employee resource groups, bias
Okay,
training, all
describe
of that.
describe that. When you say you said painful DEI. What was painful about it? Expound on that. Help me understand what that means.
Yeah. So, imagine that what the organization has done is they've gone in and looked at, okay, we need to improve our diversity numbers, right? We need to improve ERGs for almost every identity group. Leaders could lean into these are all the initiatives that we're running. But when you actually started talking to people, they give you a very different picture. So here's what emerged. Black Gen Z male in the finance department. He flat out told me, he's like, I'm supposed to feel included now because there's a Black professional ZRG. But in my actual team meetings, my ideas get talked over. My manager doesn't give me any visibility on any of the high stakes projects. But here I am, but I don't belong. And we heard that in the mining studies originally as well. And so same thing, you could have like a millennial, I'm just thinking of some of the like main people that I've spoken to recently. Millennial Filipino, a woman in operations. She was like, yeah, we did all this unconscious bias training 6 months ago. Everyone's certified. And she's like, and Andrea, wouldn't you know, I push back on a decision and I'm labeled as difficult. Nobody wants to work with me. So the training doesn't really change anything. And when we measure belonging across those 5 indicators, we found that their DEI efforts, they had successfully increased representation, more diverse faces in a room. Okay. But comfort was low because people didn't have clarity about how to navigate the difference productively. Connection, totally transactional. Why? Because the training actually made people so worried about saying the wrong thing that they actually stopped having real conversations. They're like, well, I can't say anything now.
That's not hard to predict.
Right? Contribution was like completely invisible because diverse perspectives, they were being invited, but it wasn't like it was going to impact or influence the decision making, right? Like that was like, okay, well, whatever, we've asked you, but we're not going to close the loop on anything you bring up. And we're certainly not going to, look at having that influence where we actually make change. Psychological safety was like totally, non-existent because speaking up in an environment where you can't even have a real conversation, that's hugely risky. And well-being was suffering because not only were underrepresented groups doing double duty, but when you have well-being where resilience and bouncing back is 100% on one person, it takes that much longer to bounce back. And so it wasn't just underrepresented groups who were doing double duty, even though that's the perception. It was also any group, any person going into the office feeling like you're doing so much work thinking through everything that you couldn't actually allow yourself to have a conversation to get to core issues. So, the fundamental difference between DEI and belonging, DEI asks, like, really, who's in the room? But belonging asks, is everyone able to perform at their best? And so, when we look at DEI that focuses on representation, equity in systems, inclusion practices, all of those things matter. So I'm not saying that they don't. They actually incredibly do, but they're inputs. Belonging is an output. And that is something that people really need to understand because you can have perfect representation and terrible belonging. You can have all the inclusion training in the world and still have people feeling like they have to shrink to fit in. And when we are trying to fit in, we are never going to create that belonging because 100% is put on every single individual rather than them actually understanding the benefits of being a team.
See, and
Yeah,
I
go
love
ahead.
this conversation. I love this conversation. I know that there are people probably listening thinking that just sounds like a bunch of warm fuzzies and that sounds like warm fuzzy HR stuff and that sounds cute, but does it really matter to the bottom line? And if you don't mind, I'm going to inject. Yes, it does. And in a big way. I mean, if a company's got $100 million in annual salaries and payroll in a year, and you got people that don't feel a sense of belonging and aren't engaged, and you said it, not me, cruising by at 50% of their discretionary effort, and you got $100 million payroll, how much you losing? $50 million a year? Come on. And you're like, well, it can't be that, but it is. And these same people are complaining about our labor costs are out of control. Well, no, you're paying the labor costs. You're just not getting paid because you're only getting 50 cents on every dollar you spend on labor because of these things that you're talking about. If people don't feel engaged, if they don't feel there's trust, if they don't feel they can contribute, if they don't care about what's going on. So is it worth your while to figure this stuff out? In that particular, it's 50 million reasons why it's worth it to do it.
Well, and I think that's why it's so dangerous right now, because we're seeing so many organizations rebrand DEI as belonging without changing any methodology. And so they're making the same mistakes with
You
new
know what?
language.
I'm going to stop you right there. Can
Yeah,
you, for people listening, you said that did not get by me. There are people out there rebranding belonging as or DEI as, let me rephrase this. There are people out there rebranding DEI as belonging. It's like they're just putting another new coat of paint on old stuff
totally.
that many would argue. I'm not going to pick a side on that. Many would argue there's value or not to it. Anyway, that's not my point. My point is that what you're suggesting belonging is very different from DEI.
Yeah. We actually never measure. I mean, if you look at the majority of organizations, they've never actually measured or built belonging. They looked at diversity metrics, right? And so when you treat belonging like it's less rigorous than DEI, which I've had actually executives say to me, like, DEI is about fairness and equity. That's serious. Belonging is like feelings. That's soft. And I have to stop them right there, because belonging is more measurable than most DEI metrics. And when I validated the 5 indicators that map to specific brain chemistry, have observable behaviors, I can actually predict safety incidents, turnover, innovation rates, performance outcomes. I can show you the gap between your mean and your underrepresented groups and tell you exactly where your culture is fracturing. DEI is always going to tell you who is there, right? Belonging is always going to tell you who's going to stay, who's going to speak up before problems become crisis, who's actually bringing their best versus just executing tasks. And I'm not saying organizations should abandon DEI. That's actually not what I'm saying at all.
You're just very clearly defining this is not the same thing.
100%. So what I'm saying is that if you want DEI to actually work, if you want your diverse talent to actually stay and thrive, you actually need belonging infrastructure.
Totally makes sense.
Yeah.
And thank you for expounding on that. And the other thing that I want to chime in on here, because I'm very engaged in this conversation,
Yeah, I love that.
and I know there are people that are listening. I can't say I know. I suspect there are people listening. It's like, well, this sounds overwhelming. There's so much to it. And it's like the person who's in terrible shape. And they're like, I can't be eating right and working out every day and doing all this. Like, every little bit matters. And hey, if you just worked on, hey, we're going to improve psychological safety. What can we do to improve psychological safety? Or what can we do to improve just even one of these scales at a time? You don't have to eat an elephant in one sitting. Now, you may be able to get them to do it all at once, whatnot, but I could see where people would be resistant. Oh, that'll upset a apple cart. That's going to change everything. Maybe that's a good thing, but it doesn't have to be all in one swoop. It can be gradual, one bite at a time, and still get to where you're going in manageable bite-sized chunks.
Totally. And what I would say is this, like, you actually don't have to do all 5 at the same time. So I would actually argue right now that out of those 5 indicators, start with comfort. And the reason I would start with comfort right now is because comfort actually calms the nervous system by regulating cortisol. And it's simple, right? Like, are we being clear and do we have predictability? And so I'll give you another example. An organization downsized and they needed to also completely change the amount of offerings they had under their one brand. And what they did, because they didn't actually know all the answers. And so instead of the leaders saying, here's what we know, this is what your role still is. These are the brands that we're definitely still working on. These are the targets that we still need to make. These are the things that we absolutely have to achieve. These are what your success factors look like. They went in and they talked about all the things they didn't know. And what it does, especially in today's economic and political climate with so much volatility. I mean, I remember 20 years ago when we were talking about VUCA. VUCA feels like a whole different word today. And so the best thing that you can do for all of your employees is calm their nervous system. Regulate. Think about it this way. When you walk into a room as a leader, you're either regulating or dysregulating your entire team. So if you are not able to say, these are the things that we know are true, that we know are clear, that we know are predictable, And that can even be at the start of a meeting. This is the goal of the meeting. This is who's making the decision. These are the 3 things we have to talk through. If you don't go in with those things, like have an agenda. I can't believe how many meetings start and there's no agenda and there's no specific outcomes that are needed.
They last
That
forever.
Right, it lasts forever. And you always have that person who doesn't stop talking and you're like, can you just stop talking so we can focus? So when we don't have specific behaviors, because those skills haven't been taught, because the leader doesn't understand that they're the regulator, all of this work spins and it extends the time, it impacts your quality, it impacts how creative people are at problem solving. So start with comfort. If there's one place that you're going to start with and you don't have data and you don't actually know what to do, start there. Start
Okay.
with figuring out how to be as clear for yourself first, and then as clear as you can for your team. Now, I'm going to circle back to what you talked about from that head coach, that one, I think you said 8 back-to-back
8 state
8
championships in a
state
row.
champions back-to-back.
In a row.
And so, yeah, in a row. Those coaches make it incredibly clear what is expected. What does success look like for that position, for that position, for that position? Every single offensive lineman, quarterback, receiver, it doesn't matter what the position is. They know what their job is and they know when they're not successful. And if you can't actually set that out for your employees, especially for our younger generations, with how much change there is, you cannot inspire them to think at their best, to be at their best, to be inspired, because you're making it harder for them to actually even be present.
So how can organizations balance? So this is, and I know we're tight on time, so I'll hit you with a couple real quick ones. But how can organizations balance the pressure to scale performance and efficiency with the need for belonging infrastructure?
Well, I would say they're not separate. So I think that that's actually one of the errors that a lot of people make, is that they don't understand that performance infrastructure is actually embedded with belonging indicators. And so I always talk about belonging being the science that you can feel, because when you have that infrastructure embedded within your performance metrics, that's where your engagement, your speed, your quality, your innovation, retention, that's where all of those things actually, are going on a positive trajectory where you can scale fast.
Okay.
Understanding that we're short on time. One of the things that I would highly recommend doing, we've just created it. Go take a belonging. We have a belonging breakdown to actually see. You essentially do it between you and another person. And the questions are, you don't have to put in an email address. You don't have to do anything. It's literally just a quick, fast, like, do I actually even understand where belonging might be breaking down between you and I? And so that's just at belongingfirst.com/belonging breakdown. And if you want to go further and find out indicators and learn a little bit more, you can. But just as a high level, look at some of the questions, because the questions actually give you a lot of insight into what those indicators are and how you can actually leverage them. And I would say that piece of really understanding how belonging indicators, those 5: comfort, connection, contribution, psychological safety, and well-being, are mapped. You can get a lot of that on my Substack as well. There's actually even free
Cool. That
downloads.
was going to be I had one more
Go get
question for
that
you.
stuff.
How
Yeah.
else? Might as well hit you there. What other ways can people connect with you? What's the best way? Are you active on LinkedIn? Do you like them going to your website? Do you have books or anything else? What's the best way for people to connect with you?
You bet. So LinkedIn is a great place to start. So Andrea D. Carter on LinkedIn is just my handle. And then hit me up on Substack. I have so much writing on Substack. It was where I started because my book will be launched in 2026. I'm just waiting for my deadline.
Are you going to whet our appetite? Are you going to give us a title to look for?
Not yet, because I'm waiting to see whether or not.
Okay. I had to ask.
No, it's so good that I'm like, I can't wait to actually say it out loud. However, get onto Substack. That's likely the best place. And again, it's just Substack at Andrea D Carter, and you can go on and read all sorts of posts and find out more writing and get engaged. Download some free things. Start there. Yeah.
So I'm gonna hit you with one last question because I had this one question sitting for me because it's my favorite question to ask every single guest.
Okay.
So look at us overachieving and getting to the last question ahead of time. If there was only one piece of advice that you could give to business owners or executive, what would it be and why?
Oh, that's such a good question. Stop treating belonging as something separate from performance. It's not a people initiative sitting alongside your business strategy. It's performance infrastructure. When comfort, connection, contribution, psychological safety, and well-being are present, people are going to move through friction productively instead of defaulting to that fight, flight, freeze, or faint. That's not soft. That's how work gets done. So 2 concrete action steps. Before a meeting, and I've already alluded to this, but before a meeting, have a clear agenda, a stated outcome that you're going to achieve together, and then start that meeting with a transparent context. It's not enough to just have it in your agenda. Say, here's how we're meeting, this is what we need to accomplish, and this is how decisions are going to be made. So that, again, it addresses that comfort by reducing ambiguity, that calms the nervous system, lowers cortisol, signals predictability, and it basically tells people, hey, you can put your best thinking on rather than spending energy on self-protection. Belonging is really what happens when leaders stop optimizing for efficiency and they start designing for what humans actually need to perform at their best.
I love it. Thank you so much. I appreciated every minute and I learned a ton. And I hope everyone watching, listening enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mason.